Nous estimons que la dette s'analyse d'abord de par ses origines. Les origines de la dette remontent aux origines du colonialisme. Ceux qui nous ont prêté de l'argent, ce sont ceux-là qui nous ont colonisés. Ce sont les mêmes qui géraient nos États et nos économies. Ce sont les colonisateurs qui endettaient l'Afrique auprès des bailleurs de fonds, leurs frères et cousins. Nous étions étrangers à cette dette. Nous ne pouvons donc pas la payer.
Why does the Sahel feel like it's always on the edge of something, but no one can quite explain what that something is? Why does instability erupt at the exact moments when contracts are questioned, alliances shift, or new leaders speak about sovereignty? Why did weapons flow south after Libya collapsed, but responsibility never seemed to travel with them? Why do foreign missions arrive fast, stay long, and quietly normalize themselves? Why does gold leave, uranium leave, oil leave, yet transformation hesitates at the border? Why are new regional blocs treated like disruptions instead of negotiations? Why does every solution look temporary while the structures look permanent? And who actually benefits when a region rich in resources remains labeled fragile? This isn't a story about chaos. It's a story about architecture, the invisible design shaping power in the Sahel. And once you see that design, nothing about the headlines feels random anymore. Let's get into it. Before the checkpoints multiplied, before the drones hummed overhead, before the word Sahel became shorthand for crisis, something cracked hundreds of kilometers away. In 2011, when Libya collapsed under NATO intervention, most cameras focused north. Airstrikes, regime fall, celebration, then silence. But south of Libya's borders, silence meant movement. Libya was not just a state. It was a vault of weapons, cash flows, contracts, and migrant labor networks. For decades, workers from Mali, Niger, and Chad earned wages there, sending remittances home that quietly stabilized fragile economies. When Libya fractured, that income stream evaporated almost overnight. But remittances weren't the only thing that moved. Weapons depots were looted. Anti-aircraft guns, rifles, ammunition, and equipment that had once been tightly controlled began flowing south through desert routes older than colonial borders. Fighters who had served in Libyan security structures returned home battle-hardened and heavily armed. What had been a distant war became a regional redistribution of force. Within months, northern Mali slipped from state control. Long-standing grievances among Tuareg factions fused with newly available firepower. Insurgent groups declared control over vast territories. The narrative quickly shifted. Mali is unstable. The Sahel is volatile. But volatility did not materialize out of thin air. It was transmitted. And here is the uncomfortable detail rarely emphasized in global briefings. The Sahel absorbed the consequences of a decision it did not make. The intervention in Libya was justified in humanitarian terms, debated in European capitals, executed with advanced air power, yet its destabilizing aftershocks landed primarily in African territory. No formal mechanism existed to contain the spillover. No regional compensation structure addressed the economic shock. No international tribunal calculated the secondary effects. Instead, the region was treated as though its crisis were organic. History doesn't operate that way. Security ecosystems are interconnected. When one collapses violently, neighboring systems strain. Arms trafficking routes expand. Militancy mutates. Smuggling networks professionalize. Border patrols already underfunded become overwhelmed. The Sahel did not ignite. It recalibrated under pressure. And once the recalibration began, it triggered something else, an opportunity. Because when instability spreads, it creates justification. Justification for foreign military presence. Justification for emergency funding. Justification for strategic repositioning. So here is the deeper question beneath the historical shockwave. Was the Sahel merely collateral damage of a distant intervention, or did that moment quietly open the door for a new era of external management that would redefine the region for the next decade? The door did not stay open for long. It swung wide. In 2013, France launched Operation Serval with speed and precision. Within weeks, major northern cities were retaken from armed groups. It looked decisive, it felt stabilizing. For many, it was relief. But relief has a way of stretching. Serval evolved into Operation Barkhane, a broader, region-wide counterinsurgency mission. The United Nations deployed MINUSMA, one of its largest peacekeeping operations. The United States expanded its intelligence infrastructure and drone capabilities across the region. What began as an emergency intervention gradually became architecture. Bases were built, logistics networks established, security agreements signed, intelligence sharing frameworks normalized. Counterinsurgency became the primary lens through which the Sahel was viewed internationally. And here is the subtle transformation. Once a foreign military footprint embeds itself into the terrain, physically, politically, and financially, it generates continuity. Contracts are signed for years, supply chains form, personnel rotate, budgets are allocated annually. A temporary solution hardens into a long-term posture. Yet during this same period, insecurity did not shrink. It shifted. Armed groups adapted, decentralized, and expanded into rural corridors and cross-border zones. Civilian casualties rose in certain regions. Local distrust of foreign troops increased. If security presence expands but insecurity mutates, something structural is happening. This does not automatically mean malicious intent, but it does mean the framework was incomplete. Military force can displace armed actors. It cannot alone rebuild governance, repair economic fractures, or restore legitimacy in marginalized regions. Meanwhile, the global counterinsurgency industry matured. Policy institutes produced reports. Defense contractors supplied equipment. International summits debated strategy. The Sahel became a recurring agenda item, not as a sovereign political project, but as a problem set. A pattern emerged. Violence would spike, funding would increase, troops would reposition, and then the cycle would reset. Permanent emergency. And permanent emergency benefits certain systems. It justifies external oversight. It keeps leverage alive. It sustains strategic footholds in resource-dense territory. It maintains influence over migration routes and mineral corridors. For young Africans watching from Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, the optics became difficult to ignore. A decade of intervention, yet daily life remained precarious. Checkpoints multiplied, bureaucracy thickened, sovereignty felt conditional. The deeper psychological shift began here, not from ideology, but from observation. If a solution requires 10 years and still calls itself temporary, is it truly a solution? Or has the region quietly transitioned from being stabilized to being managed? And if management replaces resolution, who ultimately defines what stability is supposed to look like? To understand why management became normal, you have to look beneath the sand. The Sahel is often portrayed as barren, with endless dunes, scattered villages, harsh climate. But under that landscape lies something far less empty. Niger holds uranium deposits that have powered foreign nuclear reactors for decades. Mali consistently ranks among Africa's top gold producers. Burkina Faso has become a major exporter in recent years. In Chad, oil flows through pipelines that rarely dominate international debate, yet matter enormously in energy geopolitics. The paradox is visible. Resource-rich territory, infrastructure-poor societies. For years, extraction followed a familiar pattern. Foreign firms secured concessions. Raw materials left unprocessed. Refining and value addition occurred elsewhere. Revenue returned partially through taxes, royalties, or aid, but the commanding heights of the value chain remained external. That model creates something subtle but powerful. Dependency without visible chains. If a country exports gold but lacks refining capacity, it depends on foreign markets for pricing power. If uranium contracts are negotiated under asymmetrical leverage, energy security for others may not translate into development security at home. If oil revenue cycles through external banking systems, domestic financial sovereignty remains limited. The wealth exists, the transformation lags. This imbalance is not unique to the Sahel. It mirrors post-colonial extraction patterns across much of Africa. But in the Sahel, Layered with insecurity, it becomes more acute. When instability is cited as the reason industrialization cannot proceed, and industrialization delay is cited as the reason instability persists, the region becomes trapped in circular logic. Security prevents development. Underdevelopment fuels insecurity. Meanwhile, mineral exports continue. Young Africans are acutely aware of this contradiction. They scroll through global markets on smartphones. They see gold prices surge. They read about energy transitions requiring strategic minerals. They understand the global appetite for resources buried beneath their soil. And they ask a question that cuts deeper than rhetoric. If the Sahel is so fragile, why is its mineral output so consistent? Stability seems to exist, at least for extraction corridors. Roads leading to mines are protected. Transport routes remain functional. International buyers receive shipments on schedule. Insurance mechanisms adapt. So perhaps the region is not uniformly unstable. Perhaps certain sectors are extremely stable. This is where the shadow war sharpens. Control over territory is one layer. Control over economic arteries is another. And when those arteries flow outward efficiently, even during political turbulence, it suggests a hierarchy of priorities. The debate emerging across Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey is no longer abstract. It is material. It concerns renegotiating contracts, increasing local processing, strengthening state oversight, and capturing more domestic value. But when such conversations intensify, reactions follow: diplomatic pressure, sanctions, and warnings of economic isolation. Which raises the next uncomfortable question. If resource sovereignty becomes the central demand, will global systems adapt to a new balance or resist any shift that threatens the old one? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel. You're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The resistance didn't begin with tanks. It began with language. Across Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, the tone shifted. Leaders stopped speaking the language of compliance and began speaking the language of renegotiation. The rhetoric moved from partnership to parity, from aid to autonomy, from coordination to sovereignty. When Ibrahim Traoré referenced Thomas Sankara, it wasn't a nostalgic performance. It was a psychological callback. Sankara had argued that dependency is rarely obvious. It hides inside contracts, inside food imports, inside financial systems that appear stable but restrict choice. That unfinished argument resurfaced in a new generation.
Faisant en sorte que chacun de nous devienne l'esclave financier, c'est-à-dire l'esclave tout court, de ceux qui ont eu l'opportunité, la ruse, la fourberie de placer les fonds chez nous avec l'obligation de rembourser. On nous dit de rembourser la dette. Ce n'est pas une question morale. Ce n'est pas une question de ce prétendu honneur que de rembourser ou de ne pas rembourser.
At the same time, something institutional happened. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formed the Alliance of Sahel States. On paper, it was a mutual defense and coordination pact. In practice, it was a signal. The signal was simple. The Sahel would experiment. Sanctions followed. ECOWAS tensions escalated. External commentary intensified. Concerns about democratic backsliding were amplified. Warnings about isolation were issued. But here's the part that changed everything. The reaction inside the region was not panic. It was defiance. For many young Africans, this wasn't recklessness. It was a test of whether sovereignty could exist outside inherited frameworks, a test of whether security cooperation could be redefined, a test of whether multipolar diplomacy could create bargaining power. Multipolarity is not an ideology. It is leverage. When Russia, China, Turkey, the Gulf states, and Western powers all seek influence, the region gains options. Options disrupt monopoly. Monopoly resists disruption. This is why recalibration feels threatening. Not necessarily because of ideology, but because predictability is power. For decades, Certain alliances were assumed. Certain security postures were automatic. Certain economic relationships were unquestioned. When those assumptions fracture, global comfort fractures with them. Of course, recalibration carries risk. Replacing one dependency with another changes flags, not structures. Military governments face the challenge of transitioning from rhetoric to institution building. Domestic accountability must match external defiance. But the deeper transformation is psychological. The Sahel is no longer asking how to be stabilized. It is asking how to negotiate. And negotiation changes posture. It changes tone. It changes the balance in rooms where decisions are made. The world now faces a different equation. A region once treated as passive terrain is actively repositioning itself, which leads to the next layer of this shadow war. If the Sahel is redefining itself, who controls how that redefinition is perceived, and who benefits from shaping that perception? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If control over land and contracts shapes power, control over perception protects it. This is where the shadow war becomes almost invisible. Open international headlines on the Sahel over the past decade. The dominant imagery is predictable. Armed convoys, desert insurgents, displaced families, emergency summits. These realities exist, but they are not the full picture. What rarely trends globally are policy recalibrations, regional trade shifts, gold processing investments, agricultural self-sufficiency programs, or diplomatic diversification. Those stories circulate locally, are debated in cafes and classrooms, but they rarely define the international narrative. Why? Because narrative is economic gravity. Credit rating agencies respond to perceived risk. Investors respond to headlines. Insurance premiums respond to instability metrics. Once a region is classified as volatile, capital becomes cautious, loans become expensive, private sector entry shrinks, the image of fragility becomes financially self-reinforcing. This is not a conspiracy, it is systemic behavior. Markets price perception, and when perception is shaped primarily through the lens of crisis, the economic consequences follow automatically. Here is where it becomes strategic. If a region begins renegotiating resource contracts, strengthening regional alliances, or asserting more economic control, the international conversation often intensifies around governance concerns. Democratic standards absolutely matter. Accountability must never be dismissed. But selective amplification shapes timing. Moments of recalibration often coincide with narrative pressure. Ask yourself, when a state quietly renews existing contracts under old terms, does it dominate global debate? Rarely. When it challenges those terms, does scrutiny rise? Almost always. Perception is leverage. This is not unique to the Sahel. Throughout history, rising actors have faced narrative resistance. When Japan industrialized rapidly in the early 20th century, it unsettled established powers. When post-war Germany re-emerged economically, it shifted European balances. When China accelerated manufacturing capacity, skepticism intensified. Power transitions attract friction. The Sahel's situation is smaller in scale, but similar in pattern. A region once viewed primarily as a security liability is attempting to reposition as a negotiating bloc. If the story remains permanent crisis, then the region remains externally managed. If the story becomes emerging leverage, then negotiation tables shift. This is why the informational battlefield matters so deeply. Young Africans understand this instinctively. Social media has disrupted traditional narrative monopolies. Local perspectives now circulate beyond editorial gatekeeping. Competing interpretations coexist in real time. The old model, where perception flowed in one direction, is eroding. And that erosion changes strategic calculus. Because if narrative no longer belongs exclusively to external institutions, then legitimacy becomes contested territory. So here's the next critical question. If perception can influence investment, diplomacy, and leverage, who ultimately decides which version of the Sahel becomes reality? If perception can tilt markets, if contracts can tilt sovereignty, if security can tilt influence, then the final battlefield isn't military. it's directional. The Sahel is no longer in the phase of shock. It is in the phase of decision. For over a decade, the region has existed under overlapping pressures: insurgency, foreign presence, resource extraction, sanctions, and shifting alliances. But now something subtler is happening. The conversation is moving from reaction to intention. What does stability look like if it is defined locally rather than externally? That question sounds abstract until you break it down. Does stability mean uninterrupted mineral exports? Or does it mean domestic processing capacity? Does security mean foreign air cover? Or does it mean regional intelligence integration and professionalized national forces? Does partnership mean aid packages? Or does it mean technology transfer and industrial equity? These are not ideological questions. They are structural. The Sahel stands at a fork. One path preserves familiarity, continued reliance on external security architecture, gradual reforms within inherited economic frameworks, incremental change that avoids confrontation. It promises predictability, but it risks preserving asymmetry. The other path is bolder: recalibrated alliances, renegotiated contracts, expanded regional blocs, institutional rebuilding from within. It promises leverage, but it carries volatility. Neither path is guaranteed. Both require competence. Here is the reality that cuts through slogans. Sovereignty is expensive. It requires disciplined budgeting, transparent procurement, judicial independence, corruption enforcement, civil-military clarity. Without those pillars, autonomy collapses into rhetoric. Young Africans across Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey are watching closely. Their patience is not infinite. Support for rupture is tied to performance. If electricity expands, if agriculture strengthens, if jobs multiply, legitimacy deepens. If daily life stagnates, narratives unravel quickly. And the external world is watching too. Global powers will not retreat from strategic territory out of sentiment. They will adjust based on leverage, negotiation strength, and mutual interest. This is why the current moment matters. For the first time in years, the Sahel is not only responding to instability, but it is attempting to redesign its position within global systems. The shadow war was never simply about insurgents or interventions. It has always been about who sets terms. Now the terms are being questioned openly. The region is no longer asking how to survive a crisis. It is asking how to convert pressure into repositioning. And this is the decision point. Will the Sahel transform its frustration into functional institutions strong enough to anchor sovereignty? Let us know in the comment section. Or will the weight of transition pull it back into managed fragility? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.